ACRL African American Studies Librarians Interest Group discussion with Elizabeth Brumfield. We will have a series going in 2019 that I'll discuss later after her presentation. I want to go ahead and give her the microphone and just thank Elizabeth for agreeing to do the Institutional Review Board 101 session with us today.
Thank you. I'm glad that I am allowed to present this. My name is Elizabeth Jean Brumfield. I'm the Distance Services Librarian for the John B. Coleman Library at Prairie View A&M University. This presentation is about, it will be about 45 minutes with time for questions. The reason that I am doing this presentation is because more librarians are doing research and there isn't a lot of information on the Institutional Review Board, which is something that you have to do when you are going to be doing research. So I have served about 6 years on the Prairie View IRB. And before that, I served as a consultant for the IRB on different literature reviews or different protocols. And I have submitted the IRB protocols. So I thought it might be something that would benefit other librarians. And I submitted to the ACRL AAS to be included in their series. The presentation is primarily for academic librarians, but I was thinking about because I was a public librarian, and I was thinking about a lot of research is done on patrons and library patrons, but rarely do public librarians get to see the IRB protocol that is actually being done in their library. So it's also, I think, good for public librarians to know some information, have information about the IRB. Some of the housekeeping things about the presentation, it is accessible, so I have added the alt text to some of the pictures. If you have a screen reader, it will show up, and I will also be reading the words that are on the screen before I talk about them. So for persons who have disabilities, they will be able to participate as well. So the agenda today, I'll do a brief introduction and background on the history of IRBs, then talk about the librarians' roles, and then questions and answers. And throughout the presentation, I do have some questions for you. They're not designed to trip you up, but they're designed to help you think more about the things that being on a board some of the questions that would be asked. You don't have to respond. If you want to respond, you can put that in the chat, but it's not required. But I'll give you a couple seconds to think about some of the questions that are included. So as an introduction, librarians have always been part of the research process, and we know that, especially in academia. However, rarely were librarians included on institutional review boards based on the research that I have done. But that is changing. As more librarians conduct research and are given faculty status, they are actually being sought out by IRBs for their expertise. Even librarians who do not have faculty status are being recruited because of their research skills and ability to consult on literature reviews and research methods. Having knowledge of institutional review boards or serving as a member expands the librarian's knowledge of the regulatory factors that affect research and helps establish the librarian within the university community as an integral part of the research process. A little bit of background and history on IRBs. So this is the first question. What is most likely the main reason IRBs were created? A, because all living organisms, including animals, deserve to be treated with respect. B, to eliminate deception in research studies. C, because of problems that arose from the Tuskegee syphilis study. D, all of the above. E, none of the above. I'm going to give you a few seconds to think about. I have gotten some answers. Okay, so A, because all living organisms, including animals, deserve to be treated with respect is not the answer. Because the IRB, even though this is a good and true statement, the IRB does not do protocols that involve animals. There is a separate department that does research that involves animals. B, to eliminate deception in research studies is also not the answer, because deception is included in and is allowed in research studies. Sometimes the research study is deception. It is looking at deception. So B is not the answer. The answer is C, and it's important to know that it's because of problems that arose from the Tuskegee syphilis study. It's very interesting. If you want to do some more research on the syphilis study, it's very interesting. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about it on the next slide. But basically, the IRB was created because the study in 1974 was determined that it was unethical. What happened was over 600 African-American men were not treated for syphilis. They were given a placebo and they were paid $5. The study started around 1932, but as you can see from my slide, I have 1932, I have 1940 in parentheses. In 1940, it was determined that that was when it started to be unethical, because at that time, it had been determined that penicillin could cure syphilis, but the study participants were not given penicillin. So as a result, many of them were sick, some even died, and it led to the establishment of the Office for Human Research Protection, or the ORP. So in 1972, it was aired that this study had been going on by a reporter, and when it aired, it caused public outrage. So that study led to the National Research Act in 1974, which led to the establishment of the Health and Human Services Policy for Protection of Human Research Subjects. As a result, all U.S. research involving human subjects must now be reviewed by a IRB. In 1946, some of these are related because they are used by the IRB. In 1946, the Nuremberg Code was used. It was a set of research, it was about a set of research ethics for human experimentation that came out of World War II, when the Germans did inhumane experiments on the people in concentration camps. And so that is the basics for the Code of Federal Regulations. There's 10 points that are in the code, and they include things like informed consent, persons that have the right to exit a study when they want to. It also includes that the study must be considered relevant to society in order for it to be done. So these are the things that came out of the Nuremberg Code. And I already talked about 1974 when the National Research Act was created, which was because of the Tuskegee experiment. Then the Belmont Report in 1978 summarizes ethical principles and guidelines for research involving human subjects. And the three core principles that they identified were respect for persons, beneficence, and justice. In 1981, the Common Rule, which is what we use now, was established, and that applied to standards for government-funded research. The main elements of the Common Rule include compliance requirements for research institutions, researchers' requirements for informed consent, requirements for the IRB membership, the board itself, the function of the board, the reviews, the record keeping, and all those things are included in the Common Rule. As of January of next year, the Common Rule, the revised Common Rule, is to go in effect, and that some of the changes in that will be some changes in the consent form, some changes in how the annual review of minimal risk studies. So that's a background. And you would think that the study, the Tuskegee study that was done, nothing similar would happen because it was viewed so unethical. But as you can see, up to even 2004, studies similar have been conducted, which is why there is still a need for IRBs. And in some countries, they do not have an IRB. This was from a newspaper that was talking about Cambodian sex workers who have HIV. A study was done by the National Institute of Health and Bill Gates charity to look at HIV in Cambodia. And like the Tuskegee experiment, a placebo was given. Women were untreated, and they were only paid $3. The primary responsibility of an IRB is to protect the rights and welfare of human research subjects and to ensure the risks undertaken by subjects are reasonable in relation to the potential benefits. If your institution accepts federal funding, you must adhere, even if your research is not federally funded, although not required by the Code of Federal Regulations governing the protection of human subjects and research. Currently, IRBs extend federal regulation to all non-federal research. So if one student gets federal aid, your institution has to have an IRB or has to use the rules regarding IRBs. IRBs are essential for policing unethical behavior, whether it is accidental or intentional. As with the Tuskegee experiment in 1932, it started out as accidental. They did not know. But after 1940, they knew that penicillin could cure syphilis, and it was then intentionally unethical research. So now we're going to go into librarians and the IRB. Any questions? If you have them, I can look at the chat real quick and see if there's any. Okay, no questions. All right. Okay, we'll go on. Okay, so there's three main roles that librarians can play in the IRB. As an ex officio member or research consultant for the IRB, as a principal investigator doing their own research, or if they have a grant or a sponsored program, or as a reviewer, board member for the IRB. So as a IRB consultant, the librarian can be used to analyze literature reviews or use as a consultant in evaluating library protocols or used to assist in plagiarism detection. The IRB may use consultants to supplement IRB reviews when the study requires expertise beyond the scope of the IRB membership. For example, if it requires scientific or scholarly expertise or knowledge about a particular procedure or characteristics of a certain population, or say religious or laws in an international area, they may decide to use a consultant. For plagiarism detection, if a IRB questions the literature review that is submitted, they may use the librarian to analyze if these are accurate or if these are relevant. So they can be used, a consultant might be used for in the IRB for that. So we have our second question. A library doctoral student is investigating software used in India to improve information literacy. He will track students' progress over the course of several semesters. His university's IRB doesn't have a librarian on board and wants to contact a librarian in India as a consultant. Do you think this is a good idea? A, yes. B, no. C, not sure. So I'll give you a minute to answer this. Let me go to the chat. Okay, I got a few answers. For this question, I would lean toward not sure. The reason, I don't think I have given you enough information to make a determination about whether or not they should use a consultant. And that's okay, because in IRB, one of the good things is that it is a board, so people get a chance to discuss and figure out. The best place to start is with the researcher themselves before a consultant. So the IRB might need to know more things. If it's just looking at software and the software the person is not going to be in India, they don't need to know the laws. There's a lot of different questions that could be asked before it is determined that you would use a consultant. So I would go with C for this. Okay, now we're going to talk about the librarian as a researcher. This is probably the area where most librarians will fall into doing their own research, either as writing a grant or as a student. Our university requires now that all theses and dissertations be submitted to the IRB. So this is an area that probably most likely you might be interested in. The IRB requirement for human subjects research can seem vague. Requirements for what constitutes research and human subjects can be confusing. Also, the levels of approval, there's exempt, there's expedited, and full board, have different requirements, and they may vary per institution. Also, before the review process has even begun, researchers are required to complete training that might take 10 to 12 hours at a time. There's also the IRB application, which can be pretty extensive, and the length of time that approvals can take, especially if you have to keep going back and doing revisions, is why many librarians may hesitate to do research involving human subjects, because they don't really want to go through the IRB process. But none of these should prevent you from doing, but it's why I'm doing this presentation, because there's kind of a mystery involved sometimes that the IRB is looked at like the IRS. And there's like negative feelings about, oh, I don't want to have to submit to the IRB. It's not that difficult. So these are examples of library research. I'm going to read each one. A multi-year study of the scholarly habits of undergraduates involves interviews with students and faculty at 6 campuses about how students do their academic work, all of which is recorded and transcribed with students' information to place into categories. The second study is a study on the impact of digital badges on student motivation for learning information literacy skills in a 1-credit course offered by the library. The librarian hopes to perhaps present the results at ALA Annual. These are actual studies. I have changed it around a little bit, added something to their research, but these are actual studies. They were not conducted from my university, and I want to say that as a disclaimer. Nothing in this presentation will implement any of the research that has gone on at Prairie View A&M University. Everything here has already been published. So as there is a confidentiality that is involved in being on an IRB board. So nothing in here is anything related to Prairie View. So anyway, so these are 2 different studies, and I want you to think about them, look at them for a minute. I'm going to ask a question. The next slide is a question about what you think on about both of these research. So based on the previous examples, which do you think would be most concerning to a reviewer and might require full board review? A, the multi-year study on student study habits. B, the digital badges study. C, both research projects. Or D, neither research project. I'm going to go back to the slides so you can read it over. Oops, I think I. Sorry, I did something. Can everyone see the presentation? Okay. I don't know why it's not showing.
You can't see it?
I can't seem to get it to the one slide. You see the
What number are you looking for?
slide 16?
We're on slide 16 now. That's what we see.
Oh, okay. All right. Okay. So the question, which of the previous examples do you think would be the most concerning to a viewer and might require a full board? The answer would be A, the multi-year study on student study habits. The reason being that the information, the scholarly habits of the student being recorded might include their grades, it might include anything could be related to study habits. The main thing is that their information is recorded so that they could be identified. And that would be something that would be concerning to a reviewer. So some tips for if you are a researcher, some tips for researchers. Research, according to the federal definition, has to be replicable and generalizable, meaning it could be applied to similar studies. So if you're saying that someone else could take your study and present it, do it the same way, and might get similar results, then that means it's replicable. And that means it's research. The essential element of exempt research are that risk are minimal and subjects' identities are not known. If the identities of the researchers can be found out, even if they are not, if you don't put their name, but you put a way that they can be identified, then that is also considered research and it would not be exempt. If data are obtained from individuals whose identities cannot be ascertained, the study is not considered human subject research and thus is not subject to regulation. It is therefore exempt from review. In this category, processes must be created that ensure the researcher cannot determine the identity of the participants. If I do a part 2, then I would go more into some of the rules and regulations. This is just really to give a short background, so don't have a lot of time to go into that. But anyway, so that's some tips for researchers. Okay, so now librarian as IRB reviewer. As a reviewer, the board members may be selected or appointed by the university president or referred from other members of the board or the head of research. However, generally the approval rests with the university president. One requirement for an IRB is that at least one member must be a non-scientist. That's on any IRB. One member must be a non-scientist. And many librarians fall into this category, which makes them ideal candidates. Some of the requirements for being on a IRB: you must attend the meetings, and a lot of them will have a cutoff, like if you miss 2 or if you don't do a percentage of them, you might be cut off, because it is a real responsibility that has to be taken seriously. There is a quorum that is required for each meeting. The minutes are recorded. They are subject to audit. They are subject to evaluation. And so it is important. You must review protocols, and it might be that you have protocols assigned to you as a member, not only as the full board. So you may be assigned a protocol to evaluate to see if it is exempt or if it is expedited. So that is a requirement of IRB member. Confidentiality is very important. Even if you want to, you might be very excited about some of the research, and I have been so excited about seeing some of the research that is done, but it is not your job to promote the research that someone is doing. So confidentiality is very important. Open-mindedness, when the IRB members get together and meet to discuss protocols, it is important to be open-minded. And I say tough-skinned because, as I said previously, sometimes the IRB is looked upon as like the IRS, like something negative, and not everybody is very happy with some decisions that are made from the IRB, or they may not be happy with having to do a revision or the time that it may take going back and forth. So you have to be tough-skinned. It's very important to follow all the regulations, and for the reviews, there are things that the federal government sends that guide in the decision making. There are decision charts that are used to help in the decision making. So it is very important that you follow regulations, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. And then finally, you must take all the required trainings and the frequent test. I'm gonna look real quick for the, okay, I am running out of time. Okay, thank you. Okay, so let me go here. This is an example of one of the parts of a refresher course. When I said you are required to take the test and do the trainings, there is a training that, several trainings that are coming up. Premier is one of the vendors, very prominent vendor of IRB trainings. They're very, very expensive. It's even online, they're like $1,000. So the university may cover some, but the ones that the city courses you have to take, and as a research you have to take the training as well, but not the exact same training. There's a lot more as a IRB member. So this is an example of some of the things that are included: the informed consent, research with prisoners, research in educational settings, methodologies and biomedical research, genetics research, population research, FDA regulated research, history and ethical principles, and it goes on and on and on. Usually there is a requirement of 100%, or I don't think I've seen anywhere 80%, but so a couple more questions. These are sample questions from, as a IRB reviewer, on a test that you may have. Question 1, which of the following populations, when considered equitable treatment of subjects, should special care be given according to IRB criteria for approval? A, prisoners, B, emancipated children, C, adult education students, or D, classroom teachers? I'll give you a couple seconds. Someone said A, and that is absolutely correct. Prisoners are considered a special population, and so when considering equitable treatment, they should be given extra care. When you fill out a protocol, it will ask if there are special populations, and one of the requirements is that a person has informed consent. So for librarians, if you have a person that cannot read and there you do not have someone to read to them or an alternative way that they get the information and you want to do research on them, then you are not giving that population special care, and that would be a problem for an IRB board. So that's just something to consider. Question 2, when research is conducted with children in educational settings, when is the assent of potential student subjects required? A, when the IRB has determined that students are capable of providing assent. B, assent from children is always required before students can take part in research. C, assent is required only when the students are over the age of 12. D, when parents determine that their children should provide assent. So I'll give you some time, just a few seconds. Okay, so the answer is A, when the IRB has determined that students are capable of providing assent. Children can take part in research studies, and the parent does not have to give their approval. The child can give their approval. There isn't a specific age, but the IRB has to determine that the child is able to understand what they are assenting to. So the answer is when the IRB has determined that students are capable of providing assent. Medical librarians are an extremely important part of an IRB if they are included. And I am quoting this from an article, and it reads, in the wake of high-profile deaths of research subjects at Johns Hopkins and 2 other locations, many in the hospital and medical library community called for an expanded role for medical librarians in the IRB process. Since 2001, an increasing number of medical librarians have had the opportunity to serve on their hospital or medical center IRB. Furthermore, additional roles for medical librarians have been created. For example, Eastern Virginia Medical School designated several institutional review board librarians. So that was taken from an article. The literature search, we may not think of it sometimes as being that important, but for this particular study that I read in 2001, a healthy volunteer at Johns Hopkins died while participating in a medical study, and the investigators concluded that the subject's death could have been prevented if a search of the medical literature prior to that time, 1966, had been performed. Additional research at the University of Pittsburgh Medical Center suggested that clinical staff was not confident in their search skills and were often unaware of the full range of library resources available for their use. So it's a good, really good statement made about the importance of librarians on IRBs. A side note, IRBs have been sued. And if you want to go into more information on, these are some lawsuits that IRBs were sued in POW. You can read more about it. In 2001, Grimes sued the IRB regarding informed consent. In 2001, Roche sued because of the IRB, because of risks that were taken during the study. Robertson in 2000, negligence. The study was approved without having a full board. And in 1999, there was a conflict of interest of the researcher, and they were able to sue the IRB. So these are, have just a few more minutes, made it almost right on time. So my final question: has this presentation assisted in providing a better understanding of institutional review boards and the role librarians can play as consultants, researchers, or board members? And there is the link to the survey. It's only a 3-question survey that will help me guide whether or not I presented the information that would benefit librarians. And I will take some questions.
Or you can type your question in the chat box. And the survey link is available in the chat box area as well.
No questions?
We'll keep it open right now because we still have 15 minutes left. And I would just like to thank you, Elizabeth, for presenting. This was very interesting information. I learned a lot today, and I hope others have as well. I would like to also open up the floor for any interested librarians, researchers who might want to share their work as far as presentations or workshops with the African American Studies Librarians Interest Group. We are accepting proposals right now through December 15th, 2018, and I'm going to go ahead and place that link in the chat box. Feel free to fill out the form, and I will contact you to let you know that your presentation has been accepted and when you'll be able to also host a webinar with us.
Well, I have a question, since we do have time. If people would put their answer in the chat. How many would, I'm just curious, how many would be interested in additional information on the regulations as a researcher? Because I think that most would fall under that as researchers. If they would like to have more information on what they need to do if they are writing a proposal or grant that is looking at human subject research. Okay, I see one. Okay, so that helps me. All right, that's good. Is anyone interested in more information on being on the board? Because I also have that. If we do another one, I would provide more information. I see some that are interested in regulations, so that seems to be what would be more of interest. I can do that as well. This, I think, was more just getting started on learning more about the IRB, but getting the nuts and bolts of what you need as a researcher and the regulations, especially with this common rule coming up. They have put it off for over a year. So it would be interesting to see some of the new regulations and how they affect librarians. Okay, I'm seeing some more that are interested. Since we have some more time, I'm going to take it to the last minute because there's some things that I left out. But I wanted to go, I didn't include this, but I think it might be interesting. Some activities that do not require IRB review. So some of the things that don't require IRB review or class projects that involve human participation and systematic research methods, but do not have more than a minimal risk and are not considered generalizable research. So you might be, as a librarian, doing your information literacy sessions, even though you may ask the students for their opinions, or you may do a test or whatever, as long as you do not keep their names that they can be identified and associate it with like their grades or something like that, you do not have to go through an IRB. So if it's information that is gathered in that way, it's not considered research. So you do not have to go through an IRB. Also, if you're doing something like this presentation, even though I asked questions, I am not making it generalizable, so it does not have to go through an IRB. You do class demonstrations or laboratory exercises, and you're in a educational setting, like you're in a lab, you're in a computer lab, and you're doing a presentation, that is not considered. Student teaching and internships do not have to go through an IRB. Something interesting, you may think like some interviews, but oral histories, and I know that I know Phyllis is the archivist, and she may do oral histories because it's related to archives and special collections. Oral histories and biographies do not have to go through an IRB. And then also things that are not about human subjects, of course, do not have to go through IRB. If you're doing just looking at data and just looking at how data is ran, or say you're looking at, I don't know, methods of something, if it's not related to humans, then of course it doesn't have to go through an IRB. I think if there's no more questions, I think we can conclude. Is that okay? Kimberly.
I am here. Uh,
Can people still hear me? Oh, really? I think the webinar will be sent. And I think it will be posted. I'm not sure where it's posted. Kimberly, can you still hear me? Oh, okay. All right. Thank you. Okay. I think I hear you.
You can hear me?
Yes, yes.
Oh my God. Okay, thank you everyone for attending. I will have the slides up in ACRL AAS in our section for the African American Studies Librarians Interest Group. And please stay tuned for our next webinar coming up in December. I will wait to tell you what that's going to be about, but it's going to be really, really cool. And I hope to bring back Elizabeth next semester so we can have a part 2 for this valuable information that I
Thank
think we
you.
all learned about today.
Good. Okay, I'm signing off. Thank you again, everyone, and have a good rest of your day.
All right, bye-bye.